She stepped off that train into the Montana cold, and every single person on that platform started laughing. Not smiling, not whispering, laughing. The man who sent for her stood perfectly still, jaw tight, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, staring at the woman he'd just legally married by proxy, a woman he'd never once laid eyes on. She was tall, broad-shouldered, plain-faced and plainly dressed, with calloused hands and mud already on her boots before she'd walked 20 feet, and tucked inside her luggage, hidden beneath folded wool and a worn leather Bible, was something that could destroy the most powerful man in the valley. Nobody knew that yet, not even her husband. If you've ever been underestimated, written off, or laughed at, this story is for you. Stay with me until the very end because what Eleanor Ashcroft does next will leave you breathless. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family. You will not want to miss what's coming. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The train was 40 minutes late. Silas Mercer stood on the platform at Dillon Station with his hat in his hands, turning the brim in slow circles the way a man does when he's trying to convince himself he hasn't made a catastrophic mistake. Around him, a loose cluster of townspeople had gathered, not because they had business at the station, but because word travels fast in a small Montana town, and the word today was Silas Mercer sent away for a wife. That alone was enough to draw a crowd. Ed Grady, who ran the feed store and had an opinion about absolutely everything, leaned against the post office wall with his arms crossed. "She's going to be soft," he said to nobody in particular. "Eastern women always are. She'll last one winter, maybe two, and then she'll be on the next train back to wherever she came from." "If she survives the first winter," said Martha Yolen, who had survived 6 of them herself and felt that gave her authority. Silas didn't turn around. He kept his eyes on the tracks. He was 34 years old, lean and weathered in the way that Montana men get weathered. Not handsomely, not romantically, but honestly. His face had been cut by wind and sun and a decade of hard decisions. His hands were scarred from barbed wire, and there was a knuckle on his left hand that hadn't healed straight since the winter of '79. He wasn't a man who complained about things like that. He wasn't a man who complained about much at all, which some people called stoic and others called cold, depending on how much they liked him. He'd sent for Eleanor Ashcroft through a reputable agency out of Chicago, Westward Hope Correspondence Services, a name that sounded more optimistic than the reality of the situation warranted. He'd written a letter that was blunt to the point of being almost rude. He had a ranch. The ranch needed running. He needed someone capable, not decorative. He had no patience for feigning spells or theater. He asked for a woman who could work, who wasn't afraid of dirt, and who understood that this was a partnership, not a fairy story. He'd received, in return, a letter from a Miss Eleanor Ashcroft of Springfield, Illinois, that was equally blunt. She said she had managed household accounts for a family of 7. She said she could ride, though not elegantly. She said she didn't expect Montana to be pleasant, and she wasn't going for pleasant. She was going because she had nothing left in Springfield, and she knew it. And at least in Montana, the nothing would be honest. He'd liked that letter. He'd read it 3 times. That was 4 months ago. The marriage had been arranged by proxy, signed and sealed and entirely legal, which meant that when Eleanor Ashcroft stepped off that train, she was already Mrs. Silas Mercer, a fact that neither of them had fully reckoned with until right now. The train appeared around the bend in a cloud of black smoke and grinding metal. The crowd on the platform shuffled forward. Silas put his hat back on. Chet. The passengers who stepped off first were the expected ones. A traveling merchant with too many bags, a young couple clearly on their honeymoon and miserable about the destination, a circuit preacher in a coat that had seen better decades. Then the platform emptied into the ordinary business of arrival, and Silas was beginning to wonder if she'd missed the train entirely, which would have solved several problems simultaneously. Then Eleanor Ashcroft stepped out. She had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, not by much, but enough that people noticed. She was tall, nearly as tall as Silas himself, with a solid, square-shouldered build that suggested she'd done physical work her entire life and wasn't embarrassed about it. Her dress was dark blue wool, practical and plain, and her dark hair was pinned up with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd done it herself in about 45 seconds on a moving train. She was 31 years old and looked it. Not old, not young, but settled in her face in a way that most people in Dillon hadn't seen before. She carried one large leather trunk and a canvas bag over her left shoulder, and she carried both without apparent difficulty. She stepped onto the platform, set her trunk down, and looked at the crowd. The crowd looked back. And then Ed Grady laughed. Not a polite laugh, not a surprised laugh. A genuine, full-bellied, I cannot believe what I'm seeing laugh. And once Ed started, a few others followed, the way people always follow the first one who breaks, because laughing alongside someone feels safer than standing alone in silence. Silas felt his jaw tighten so hard his back teeth ached. Eleanor didn't flinch. That was the thing that surprised him. She heard the laughter. He could tell she heard it because her eyes moved across the crowd with a slow, calm, deliberate attention. The way a person catalogs information rather than absorbs insults. She wasn't performing dignity. She wasn't fighting tears. She was simply assessing. Her eyes found him because he was the only one not laughing. He was standing perfectly still about 15 feet away, hat on, face unreadable, watching her the way you watch something you haven't decided about yet. She picked up her trunk and walked toward him. The crowd parted, still murmuring, still chuckling at the edges. She stopped 2 feet in front of him. Up close she was. Not what he'd imagined, though he'd tried very hard not to imagine anything. Her eyes were dark gray, almost the color of storm clouds over the Bitterroot Range, and they were absolutely steady. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was low and clear. "Miss Ash." He caught himself. "Miss Ash." He caught himself. "Mrs. Mercer." The word felt strange in his mouth, like biting into something unfamiliar. "Long trip." "It was," she said. "Your town has opinions." "My town usually does." She glanced over her shoulder at the platform, where the stragglers were still watching. "Are any of them going to be useful to us, or are they just here for the entertainment?" Silas blinked. Something shifted in his chest. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. "Mostly entertainment," he said. "Let me take the trunk." "I've got it." "I didn't say you couldn't. I said, let me take it." A pause. She looked at him for a moment, then set the trunk down between them. "Fine." He picked it up. It was heavy. He didn't show that, and she didn't comment on it, and somehow that small exchange set the tone for everything that followed. The ride out to Red Ridge Ranch took an hour and a half in the wagon, through terrain that had broken better men than Silas Mercer, and would probably break more before it was finished. Eleanor sat beside him on the bench, her canvas bag in her lap, and for a long while neither of them spoke. The mountains were doing their October business. The aspen groves had gone yellow gold, and the sky had that particular blue that only exists in high country autumn, so deep it almost looked painted. Silas didn't notice it anymore. He'd grown up here. Eleanor was quiet, but she was looking. He could see her taking in the land the way she'd taken in the crowd at the station, methodically, without sentiment. Her eyes moved over the ridgelines, the creek beds, the condition of the fence posts along the road. "Your fencing's rotting in places," she said finally. "I know. How many hands do you run?" "Right now, 8, down from 14 in the spring." "Why?" He was quiet a beat. "Better offers." She turned to look at him. "Better offers from who?" "Man named Victor Blackthorne. Runs the Anvil Creek operation, east side of the valley. He's been recruiting. Poaching. Some would say that." "I would say that," Eleanor said flatly. "What's he paying them?" "More than I can match right now." Silas kept his eyes on the road. "Cattle prices dropped last season. We're not broke, but we're close enough to smell it." Eleanor was quiet again. He couldn't tell if she was discouraged or thinking, and that uncertainty bothered him more than he expected. "The agency letter said you had a going concern," she said. "It is a going concern. It's going just slower than I'd like." He paused. "I was honest in my own letter about what I needed." "You were," she agreed. "I'm not complaining. I'm building a picture." He glanced at her. She was staring at the road ahead, and her expression was still that same settled, deliberate calm. "You do that a lot?" he asked. "Build pictures?" Constantly, she said. It's how I know what to do next. They rode the last 40 minutes in silence, but it was a different silence than it had started. Red Ridge Ranch announced itself poorly. The main house was a two-story log structure that had been well built once and was now in the slow process of becoming something less. The porch had a board missing. The yard between the house and the bunkhouse was churned mud and scattered equipment. Two dogs came out barking, then lost interest halfway through the job and wandered back. From the cookhouse came a smell that Eleanor identified in about 3 seconds as beans that had been on the fire too long, and she said nothing, but something in her expression tightened. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He had 4 of his 8 remaining cowboys gathered near the bunkhouse, and they were watching the wagon with the elaborate casualness of men pretending they weren't watching. "Boys," Silas said, "come meet Mrs. Mercer." They came over in the shuffling way that cowboys do, hats in their hands, ranging from about 19 to 40. A stocky, sandy-haired man named Pete Dunlap, who was Silas's most reliable hand. A young Mexican cowboy named Carlos Reyes, who had only been with the ranch since July, but had already proven worth twice what he was paid. A broad, quiet man named Holt, who nobody had ever heard give his first name and nobody asked anymore. And then a 4th man, Deke Calloway, tall and loose-limbed with the kind of smile that meant he thought something was funny and was waiting for someone to ask him what. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon without assistance and stood in the mud and looked at them. "Ma'am," said Pete with genuine politeness. "Ma'am," said Carlos. Holt nodded. Deke Calloway let his eyes move over Eleanor with slow, obvious amusement, and then he cut his gaze to Pete and let a small smirk settle onto his face, the kind of look that men pass between each other when they're thinking something they know better than to say out loud. But the smirk was loud enough. Eleanor saw it. She cataloged it the same way she'd cataloged everything else, and said nothing. "I'd like to see the house," she said to Silas. "Sure." He picked up her trunk again. "This way." The interior of the main house was functional and joyless. There was a main room with a table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace that needed cleaning, and very little else that suggested anyone had ever tried to make it anything other than a place to sleep and stop being cold. The kitchen was a separate room off the back. A wood stove, a work table, a shelf of supplies in varying states of depletion, and the kind of accumulated grime that happens when a man has been feeding himself out of a can for 6 months. Silas set the trunk at the bottom of the stairs and stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at Eleanor looking at the kitchen, and he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Embarrassed. Not about the state of the ranch, he'd been honest about that. Embarrassed about the kitchen specifically, which was somehow more personal. "I know it's not," he started. "Where does the cook sleep?" Eleanor asked. "Bunkhouse." "What's he been making?" "Beans, mostly. Salt pork. Biscuits when he remembers." "When did you last have a real meal in this house?" Silas thought about it honestly. "March," he said. "Maybe February." Eleanor turned around and looked at him directly. "I'm going to need a complete inventory of what's in that supply shed," she said. "And I want to see the ranch accounts." He stiffened. "The accounts are my business." "They're our business," she said. Not sharp, not aggressive, just factual. "I'm not asking to take something from you, Mr. Mercer. I'm asking to understand what I'm working with. A picture, like I said." He held her gaze for a long moment. Outside, the wind was picking up off the mountains, rattling something loose on the porch roof. "Fine," he said at last. "I'll get the ledger after supper." "Good." She turned back to the kitchen and pushed her sleeves up to her elbows. "And the cook, what's his name?" "Angus. Angus Price." "He'd been drinking on the job?" Silas paused. "What makes you ask that?" She pointed to the shelf without turning around. There was a ceramic crock shoved behind the salt sack that was definitely not flour. "Because that crock isn't vinegar," she said. Silas looked at it. He'd honestly never noticed it before. "I'll talk to him." "I'll talk to him," Eleanor said. She pulled a cast iron pan off the hook on the wall and examined the bottom of it. "Tomorrow morning, after I've had a night to think." She set the pan on the stove with a solid, decisive clank. Tonight I'll make supper. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She glanced back at him over her shoulder, and for just a second something crossed her face that wasn't quite amusement but was in the neighborhood of it. Go check your fences, Mr. Mercer. I'll call when it's ready. He stood there for another moment, holding the strange sensation of not being in charge of his own kitchen, in his own house, on his own ranch. It was uncomfortable. He was surprised to find it wasn't entirely unpleasant. He put his hat on and went outside. That night, Eleanor made a pot roast from a cut of beef she found in the cold storage, with onions and dried herbs and a gravy that took 40 minutes and an enormous amount of patience. She made biscuits from scratch, real ones, not the flattened pale discs that Angus Price had been producing, and a dried apple cake from a bag of apples she found pushed to the very back of the supply shelf. She fed Silas in the main house and sent a full pot and a basket of biscuits out to the bunkhouse. She didn't eat with him. She ate standing at the kitchen counter watching the stove because there was still cleaning to do and she wanted to finish before it got too late. She could hear him in the next room. The scrape of a fork, the occasional sound of a man eating something decent for the first time in a long while and not knowing what to do with that. He appeared in the kitchen doorway when he was done, carrying his plate. That was, he started, and then seemed to run out of words for a moment, which she suspected didn't happen to him often. Good, he settled on. That was good. I know, she said. Leave the plate. He set it by the basin and leaned against the door frame, watching her scrub the work table. You didn't eat with me, he said. I'll eat when I'm done. That's not... He stopped. Not what? She asked without looking up. Nothing, he said. I'll get the ledger. He brought it and set it on the kitchen table, and she sat down with it after she'd finished cleaning, reading through 2 years of accounts by lamplight while the Montana wind shook the windows and the fire burned down to coals. The numbers were not good. They were not catastrophic, but they were not good, and there was a pattern in them that made her go very still, staring at the page. She recognized the pattern. She'd seen it before, in a different set of books, in a different state years ago, and recognizing it made something cold settle in the pit of her stomach. She closed the ledger. She sat in the dark kitchen for a long while, alone. She had known, when she boarded that train, that coming to Montana was the right move. She had told herself it was about starting over, about finding solid ground after everything that had been taken from her. She had told herself it was coincidence that the Mercer Ranch sat in the same valley as the Anvil Creek operation. She was not good at lying to herself, and she'd known then it wasn't coincidence. But sitting in this kitchen, in this cold house, with the sound of Silas Mercer's boots moving around overhead as he prepared for bed, a man who'd been cheated slowly and didn't even know it yet, she felt the weight of the thing she was carrying differently than she had before. Heavier. More complicated. She reached into her canvas bag and touched, briefly, the edge of a leather-bound ledger that was not this ledger. Thinner. Older. Filled with different numbers in a different hand. Numbers that told a story so damning that she'd carried them for 3 years without telling a single soul. She took her hand out of the bag and folded it in her lap. One thing at a time, she told herself. The ranch first. The rest? Later. She got up, banked the fire, and went to bed. Outside, the October wind came off the mountains and swept through the valley, and the sign above the ranch gate swung and creaked in the dark. Red Ridge Ranch, the letters half worn away. And somewhere in the distance, in a much larger house on the east side of the valley, a lamp was still burning. She was up before anyone else on the ranch. That was not an accident. Eleanor had learned years ago that the first hour of the morning belongs to whoever claims it, and she intended to claim it thoroughly. She was dressed and downstairs by 5, moving through the dark kitchen by the light of a single lamp, getting her bearings in a space that was still foreign to her hands. She found where things were. The flour sack, the lard tin, the coffee grinder that had a cracked handle someone had wrapped in rawhide and never replaced. She started the fire in the stove, filled the coffee pot, and stood at the kitchen window while the water heated, watching the sky above the mountain ridge go from black to the particular bruised purple that comes just before dawn. The ranch was quiet, but it was not peaceful. There's a difference. Peaceful means something has settled. Quiet means something is waiting. Eleanor had lived long enough to know which one Red Ridge Ranch was. She'd spent a good part of the night with Silas's ledger, and what she'd found in it had kept her awake longer than she'd intended. The losses were consistent in a way that random bad luck never is. Cattle counts that didn't match grazing records, supply invoices that were slightly, persistently too high, as though someone had been skimming off the top for long enough that they'd gotten comfortable with it. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to bleed a ranch slowly. The kind of bleeding that, over 2 years, could bring a solid operation to its knees. She knew that pattern. She knew exactly who had taught it to her, in the worst possible way. But that was not today's problem. Today's problem was a drunken cook and a bunkhouse full of men who'd already decided she was a joke. She heard the cookhouse door slam at 5:30. Angus Price, stumbling toward the outhouse with the unsteady gait of a man who'd been drinking since the night before and hadn't entirely stopped. Eleanor poured herself a cup of coffee, let it cool for 30 seconds because she didn't have patience for longer than that, and drank half of it standing up. Then she put on her coat and walked across the yard. She found Angus coming back from the outhouse, squinting against the cold morning air. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a gray beard that had things living in it that Eleanor didn't intend to investigate. He stopped when he saw her coming and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has been caught but hasn't yet decided whether to be defensive or conciliatory. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," she said. "How much did you drink last night?" He blinked. "I don't see how that's—" "Angus." She said his name the way you'd set a flat stone down. No anger, no apology. "I found the crock behind the salt sack. I also found the one under the work table and the one behind the flour bin. That's 3 in the kitchen alone, and I imagine there are more in the bunkhouse. I'm not interested in judging you. I'm interested in the job." She paused. "Can you cook when you're sober?" He was quiet for a moment, and something in his face shifted, the defensiveness folding inward, which was more honest than bluster. "Used to be able to," he said. "When did that stop?" He looked away toward the mountains. "Wife died 4 years back," he said. "Went downhill some after that." Eleanor absorbed this without turning it into a moment. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said plainly, "but the men here are eating bad food and losing morale, and a ranch without morale is already halfway gone. So here's what's going to happen. Starting this morning, I'll run the kitchen. You can stay on and help if you're useful, or you can move on. That's your choice. But the drinking during work hours ends today." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking." Angus looked at her for a long moment. He was trying to find something to be angry about and coming up mostly empty. "Mr. Mercer know about this?" he asked. "Mr. Mercer will know by breakfast," she said. "Go wash your face." She turned and walked back to the main house. She didn't look back to see if he followed, because looking back would have suggested she wasn't sure, and she was sure. Not because she was fearless, her heart was beating harder than she'd have liked, but because the alternative to moving forward was standing still, and standing still in this valley was how you ended up slowly swallowed by it. By the time Silas came downstairs at 6, Eleanor had biscuits in the oven, a proper pan of scrambled eggs and salt pork on the stove, coffee made that didn't taste like hot mud, and had begun a written inventory of every supply on the kitchen shelves, cross-referenced against the invoices she'd found folded in the back of the ledger. Silas stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at all of this. "You sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said. "There are discrepancies in your supply invoices." He poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "What kind of discrepancies?" "The kind where someone's been charging you for 10 pounds of flour and delivering 8 for about 14 months. She handed him the page where she'd noted it, the numbers laid out in her clean, efficient handwriting. "It's not just the cook, it's whoever you're buying from in town." Silas looked at the page. His expression was still, but his jaw did something that suggested considerable internal movement. "Harlan's Dry Goods," he said quietly. "Harlan's," she confirmed. "Do you know who owns it?" He set the page down. "Brother-in-law of Victor Blackthorne," he said. The name landed in the kitchen like something dropped from a height. Eleanor kept her face neutral, though the word Blackthorne moved through her chest like a cold finger. She turned back to the stove and checked the biscuits. "That would explain the consistency of it," she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her first name, which neither of them acknowledged. "How'd you catch that so fast?" She was quiet for a beat. "I've seen books cooked before," she said. "I know what it looks like." She pulled the biscuits out and set them on the work table. "Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes. I told Angus he can stay on if he keeps sober and helps where I direct him. If you have objections, tell me now." "No objections," Silas said slowly, still looking at the page of numbers. She sent him to tell the hands breakfast was in the cookhouse. And while he was gone, she stood alone in the kitchen for exactly 30 seconds with her hands pressed flat on the work table, breathing deliberately. The name Blackthorn. She had known she would hear it. She had moved 3,000 miles specifically to hear it, but hearing it still did something physical to her. A tightening behind her sternum that was equal parts fury and something older and deeper, something that had no clean name. She straightened up, picked up the pan, and got to work. The reaction in the bunkhouse when Pete Dunlap set Eleanor's food on the table was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. It was the reaction of 8 men who have been surviving on bad beans for 6 months, suddenly encountering real food. A moment of complete silence, followed by the kind of eating that requires no conversation because conversation would be a waste of time that could otherwise be spent on biscuits. Carlos Reyes finished half his plate and looked up with an expression of genuine reverence. "This is the best thing I've eaten since I left Sonora," he said. Pete nodded. "Don't tell Angus that." Then he reconsidered. "Actually, tell him. Maybe it'll motivate him." Holt ate everything on his plate and then ate what Pete left, which was unusual enough that Pete noticed and let it happen, which said something about Holt's state of nutrition over the preceding months. Deke Calloway ate too, but he did it with that loose, sly quality he carried everywhere, and when he was done, he leaned back on the bench and said, loud enough to carry across the room, "Well, at least she can cook." He said it the way you'd say at least the ugly horse runs, and a couple of the newer hands, men Eleanor didn't know yet, didn't trust yet, laughed a little. Eleanor was not in the bunkhouse. She was in the cookhouse, organizing the supply shelves. But Pete Dunlap heard it, and his expression went flat. Carlos Reyes looked down at his plate. Holt kept eating, but his big shoulders shifted slightly, the way a heavy door shifts when the wind changes direction. Silas heard it too, from the doorway. He'd come over to tell the hands about the morning's work rotation, and he'd caught Deke's words and the laughter, and he stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression nobody could quite read. He did not say anything. He filed the moment away. He had enough experience with men to know that some situations needed to resolve themselves, and that stepping on this one prematurely would only delay the inevitable. He was right, though he couldn't have known exactly how the resolution would arrive. It came 3 days later. Those 3 days changed something at Red Ridge Ranch, though it happened too gradually for any individual man to point to the exact moment. Eleanor's presence simply rearranged things, not through any announcement or proclamation, but through the basic and relentless logic of competence. The meals improved dramatically and stayed improved, which meant the men were eating well and sleeping better, which meant their energy was up and their irritability was down. She fixed the supply situation by switching to a dry goods operation in a town 12 miles further than Harlan's, which cost an extra hour's travel, but saved more than it cost within the first week. She found 2 errors in the last month's payroll accounting that would have shortchanged Carlos and Pete by a combined $9, corrected them, and said nothing about it to Silas until he saw the corrected sheets on the kitchen table and came to find her. "You fixed the payroll," he said. "There were mistakes. I know there were. I just didn't catch them." "You have a lot to keep track of," she said without inflection. He stood there a moment. "The men are working better," he said. "They're eating better. It's the same thing." "Is it that simple?" "Most things are," she said, "once you figure out what the problem actually is." He looked at her for a moment and then looked away, out the kitchen window, and she could see him thinking about something that he wasn't going to say yet. She didn't push. She'd learned something in these 3 days. Silas Mercer was a man who needed to arrive at things in his own time, and the worst thing you could do with him was try to hurry him. He'd just dig in and go quiet, and then you'd have achieved nothing except a longer silence. The confrontation with Deke Calloway happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Eleanor had gone to the barn to check on a supply of hay she'd ordered, which had been delivered that morning and stacked by 2 of the hands. She was measuring and noting the quantity, more of her picture building, when she heard boots on the barn floor behind her and turned to find Deke Calloway leaning against a stall post with his arms crossed and that loose, sly smile arranged on his face like furniture he'd put there on purpose. "Need something?" she asked. "Just checking what's going on in here," he said. "Got to keep an eye on things." "Things seem fine," she said, and turned back to her count. "Must be strange for you," Deke said, after a pause that was clearly intended to get her to ask what before he continued. She didn't ask. He continued anyway. "Coming out here? Silas put that ad out for a wife, and what he got was—" He tilted his head. "Well, you." Eleanor finished her count. She wrote the number on the paper she was holding, folded the paper, and put it in her coat pocket. Then she turned around and looked at Deke Calloway with the same deliberate, cataloging attention she'd given the crowd at Dillon's station on the day she arrived. "What is it you're actually saying, Deke?" she asked. He shrugged, spreading his hands in the gesture of a man pretending he's being reasonable. "Nothing unkind, just that Silas probably had a different picture in his head. And you're a good cook, nobody's arguing that. But there's more to a wife than—" "You're right," Eleanor said. "There is more to it." He blinked, not expecting the agreement. "There's the accounting," she continued, moving toward him at a steady, unhurried pace, "which I've corrected twice in the last week because apparently nobody was checking it. There's the supply chain, which was being systematically robbed through Harlan's dry goods, which nobody caught until I'd been here 3 days. There's the hay inventory, which is what I'm doing right now, because when I checked the delivery records against last year's usage, I found we're running short for winter, and I want to know by how much before I order more." She stopped about 4 feet from him. "What is it you do here exactly, Deke?" The smile was still on his face, but it had changed quality. It was thinner now, less furniture, more reflex. "I'm a ranch hand," he said. "I know. So is Carlos, and Carlos works twice as hard and doesn't spend his mornings making comments about things that aren't his business." She held his gaze. "You want to have a problem with me? That's fine. Have your problem. But you'll do it on your own time, not on ranch time, and not in front of the men, and not at my table." She paused. "Are we clear?" From behind her, she had not heard him come in, Pete Dunlap said quietly, "We're clear." He was standing in the barn doorway, and Holt was behind him, and Carlos was behind Holt, and the three of them had arrived at some point during the conversation with the timing of men who hadn't coordinated it, but had arrived at the same conclusion independently. Deke looked at them. He looked back at Eleanor. Something moved behind his eyes, the calculation of a man realizing that the room has shifted and that the shift happened while he was busy being smug. He uncrossed his arms and pushed off the post. "No problem here," he said, and his voice was carefully light, performing casualness the way a bad actor performs calm. He walked past Eleanor toward the barn door, and Pete and Holt and Carlos stood aside to let him through, which was a worse dismissal than stopping him would have been. He was gone. Eleanor turned back to the hay. "Thank you," she said to the 3 men. "Didn't do anything," Pete said. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm thanking you for." She heard Pete's quiet exhale behind her, something between a laugh and a sigh, and then the sound of boots on the barn floor as they went back to their work. The story of that conversation traveled through the bunkhouse the way stories do in closed quarters, with additions and embellishments that Eleanor could not have predicted and would probably not have approved of. By supper it had become something larger than it was, as bunkhouse stories always do. What mattered was not the details but the effect, which was this. When Eleanor brought the supper pots to the cookhouse that evening, the room went quiet in a different way than it had before. Not the quiet of men uncertain what to make of her, the quiet of men who have settled something in their minds. Carlos Reyes pulled out the chair at the head of the table, not Silas's place, which was at the main house, but the head of the bunkhouse table, and said, "Mrs. Mercer." She looked at the chair. She looked at Carlos. She sat down. Silas found out what had happened with Deke Calloway that evening when Pete gave him a version of events that was more straightforward than the bunkhouse version. He didn't go to Eleanor about it that night. He stood on the porch for a while in the dark, turning his hat brim in his hands again. That same nervous motion. And he was thinking about something he hadn't let himself think about since the day she arrived, because it was the kind of thing that complicated a situation he needed to keep simple. He'd married her because he needed a partner. That was the honest reason, and he'd been honest about it, and she'd accepted it honestly. There was no pretense between them, which was the one thing he'd insisted on, and the one thing she'd apparently had no trouble giving. He wasn't a man who believed in romantic nonsense, and he'd been careful, very careful, not to let himself look at Eleanor Ashcroft and think anything beyond what was practical and necessary. But standing on the porch, he was thinking about the way she'd looked at those numbers in the ledger, the speed of it, the certainty, the fact that she'd seen in one night what had been bleeding him for 14 months. He was thinking about the quiet authority of a woman who'd walked into a failing kitchen and turned it into the heart of the operation in 72 hours. He was thinking about Pete's words. She didn't back down, Silas. She just didn't. And the note of something in Pete's voice that sounded like what Silas himself was beginning to feel and didn't have a name for yet. He put his hat on and went inside. Eleanor was at the kitchen table again, by lamplight. She had Silas's ledger on one side and her own notebook on the other, and she was writing figures in a column with the focused, inward expression of someone doing serious arithmetic in her head. She had taken her hair down at some point in the evening, and it was loose around her shoulders, which was the first time he'd seen her that way, and he looked at her for just a second longer than was strictly necessary before he said, "I heard about Calloway." She didn't look up. "Pete told you." "Pete told me." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "You handled it well." "I handled it the only way that works," she said, "which is directly." She made a note in the column. "He'll be a problem again." "Maybe." "Not maybe. He's the kind of man who needs to test things more than once." She looked up. "You should know that about the men you keep." Silas leaned back in the chair, looking at her. "What do you think I should do about him?" She was quiet for a moment, which he'd come to understand was not hesitation, but consideration. "Keep watching," she said. "Blackthorn's been poaching your hands. Calloway's the kind of man who gets bought without knowing he's being sold." She paused. "He hasn't done anything yet that warrants dismissal. But watch." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "You know a lot about how men like that operate," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've had reasons to learn," she said, and went back to her figures. He sat with that answer for a moment, turning it over. It had edges he couldn't see all the way around, and he knew it, and he knew that she knew he knew it, and the fact that she hadn't offered more was as deliberate as everything else she did. Outside, the October cold had sharpened into something that meant serious business. Winter coming in off the mountains earlier than usual, or so Pete had said that morning with the authority of a man who'd been reading this particular sky for 15 years. Silas had extra work to do in the morning: fence repairs, hay storage, a windbreak that needed strengthening on the north side of the pasture before the first real snow. He had 8 men and too many tasks, and not enough money, and a rival who was circling the valley like something patient and hungry. But the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and across the table a woman he hadn't expected and didn't understand was doing the kind of focused, essential work that keeps a place alive, and the ledger she'd corrected was sitting on the corner of the table with its numbers more honest than they'd been in over a year. He was not a man who allowed himself comfort easily. He'd learned too young that comfort made you slow. But he sat there a few minutes longer than he needed to, in his own kitchen, before he pushed the chair back and went upstairs to sleep. Eleanor kept writing until the lamp started to gutter and the fire was down to orange coals. Then she closed the notebook, both notebooks, and sat for a moment in the near dark. 14 months of skimming through Harlan's dry goods, a rival who owned Harlan's brother-in-law, cowboys being quietly recruited away from a ranch that was being quietly bled. It was all one mechanism, and she knew it, and she was sitting in the middle of it with a ledger in her bag that could unravel the man who'd built it, but only if she moved carefully, and only if she moved at the right moment. She was not there yet. She needed time, and she needed Silas to trust her, not because she intended to use him, but because what was coming would require both of them, and she couldn't ask for his trust and his help in the same breath she told him the truth. She needed to earn the first before she could survive the second. She blew out the lamp and went to bed in the dark. Upstairs, the wind found a gap somewhere in the eaves and whistled through it, thin and persistent, like a question that wasn't going to stop until someone answered it. The first snow came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Eleanor arrived. It wasn't the killing kind, not yet. It was the warning kind, an inch or two that melted off the lower pastures by noon, but stayed white on the ridge lines. A reminder from the mountains that they were in charge of the calendar up here, not the men who'd built fences across their slopes. Silas was out before first light with Pete and Carlos checking the windbreak on the north pasture, and Eleanor spent the morning taking full inventory of the winter supply situation with Angus, who had, against most expectations including his own, remained sober for 11 consecutive days. He was not a transformed man. Sobriety had not made Angus Price cheerful or talkative or suddenly useful in any spectacular way. What it had done was reveal a competence underneath the wreckage, a man who actually knew his way around a kitchen when his hands weren't shaking, who remembered, once he was reminded, how to properly store root vegetables for winter and how to stretch salt pork across a month without the men losing their minds. Eleanor worked alongside him without sentiment about it. She didn't praise him for staying sober the way you'd praise a dog for learning a trick. She just noted what he could do and used it. "We're short on salt," Angus said, squinting at the shelf. "By about 30 pounds, I'd say." 28, Eleanor said, checking her notebook. "I'll add it to the order for Morrison's." Morrison's was the dry goods in Fenton, 12 miles east, which Eleanor had switched to after the Harlan discrepancy. The owner was a small, precise man named Gerald Morrison, who had been startled and then visibly pleased when Eleanor had walked in 3 weeks ago, placed a detailed and accurate order, and paid exactly what the invoice said without argument. He'd given her a 10% discount on the second order without being asked, which was its own form of respect. She was writing the salt into the order sheet when she heard the wagon come into the yard. Through the kitchen window, she could see it wasn't Silas's wagon. It was a hired rig, a nice one, with a driver in a good coat, and it pulled up in front of the main house and stopped. The man who climbed down from the passenger side was tall and well-dressed, in the particular way that men with new money dress in a new territory, which is to say expensively but not quite right. The clothes fitting like something purchased quickly and worn with more confidence than they warranted. He was perhaps 45, with a broad, clean-shaved face and the kind of careful pleasantness in his expression that Eleanor recognized as the expression of a man who has practiced looking pleasant so long that it no longer connects to anything underneath. She stood very still at the window. She had not seen Victor Blackthorne in 4 years. He had been thinner then and less polished. Montana had agreed with him, apparently. Montana and stolen money agreed with a great many people. She stepped back from the window before he could see her. "Angus," she said, keeping her voice at its normal register, "finish the count and leave the sheet on the table. I'll be in the main house." She went out the back door and came around to the front of the house through the side so that she was on the porch and moving toward the door before the visitor had reached the steps. Victor Blackthorne looked up and saw her, and something crossed his face. Fast, controlled, gone in less than a second. A man who was good at his face. She'd forgotten how good. "Good morning," he said, in the warm, reasonable voice she also remembered. "I'm looking for Silas Mercer." "He's out on the range," Eleanor said. She did not open the door. "Can I help you?" "Victor Blackthorne, Anvil Creek Ranch." He extended his hand with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to his name doing work for him. "I'm a neighbor, wanted to pay my respects to the new Mrs. Mercer." A pause, during which his eyes moved over her with that same controlled, measuring quality. "I heard Silas sent for a wife." "You heard right," Eleanor said. She shook his hand briefly. Her hand was steady. She was proud of that. "Eleanor Mercer." Nothing in his face moved. "Pleasure," he said. "Is Silas expected back soon?" "By noon," she said. "I'll tell him you came by." "I'd appreciate that." He held her gaze a beat longer than necessary, and she held it back, and for just that second they were two people who knew exactly who the other was and were both pretending otherwise, which was a kind of communication more precise than most conversations. "Welcome to the valley, Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Thank you," she said. "It's a fine valley." He nodded, went back to the rig, and left. Eleanor stood on the porch until the wagon had rounded the bend in the road and disappeared, and then she went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the wood and breathed deliberately for about 30 seconds. He hadn't recognized her, or he'd recognized her, and was hiding it. She couldn't be certain which, and the uncertainty was its own problem. She pulled the canvas bag from under the kitchen side table and opened it and looked at the ledger inside. The thin one, the old one, the one with Victor Blackthorne's handwriting on half the pages. She didn't take it out. She just looked at it the way you look at a weapon you're not ready to use yet. Then she closed the bag and put it back and started making lunch. When Silas came in from the range, mud on his boots and cold in his face, she told him about the visitor in the same neutral tone she used for everything. Victor Blackthorne came by this morning, she said. Said he wanted to pay his respects. Silas stopped pulling off his boot. Blackthorne came here. Drove up in a hired rig. Left when I told him you were out. He set the boot down slowly. What did he want? He said what he wanted was to meet me. Whether that was the actual reason is a different question. She set a plate of food in front of him. What does he usually want when he comes around? He doesn't usually come around, Silas said. He sat down but didn't eat, looking at the wall with the expression of a man running calculations. He sends men, or lawyers. He looked at Eleanor. He came himself. Yes, she said. That's not normal. No, she agreed. It isn't. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him on the edge of a question, a specific question, one that went further than the surface of things. He pulled back from it. She saw him decide to, and she was simultaneously relieved and aware that the reprieve was temporary. It lasted 9 more days. In those 9 days, 3 things happened that each mattered individually and together mattered enormously. The first was that Deke Calloway disappeared from the ranch on a Thursday evening and reappeared the following Friday with $60 extra in his vest pocket and the careful inward expression of a man who has committed himself to something. Eleanor noticed the money because she noticed everything, and said nothing because she needed to see what he did with the commitment before she understood the full shape of it. The second was a telegram that arrived for Eleanor at the Dillon post office, which she collected herself on a supply run. The telegram was from a lawyer named Arvid Crane in Springfield, Illinois. It read, Your brother V.B. aware of your location. Advise extreme caution. Documents still secure? Eleanor sent back a single-word reply, yes, and burned the original telegram in the fire pit behind Morrison's dry goods before driving the wagon home. She thought about that word. Brother. Arvid had used the word loosely, the way lawyers use words loosely when they want to keep a telegram short. Half-brother was the accurate term, and even that felt like a generosity toward Victor Blackthorne that he hadn't earned. The third thing was what Silas found in his own barn. He found it on a Sunday night, late, when he'd gone out to check on a mare that had been favoring her left foreleg. He was in the back stall working by lantern light when his boot caught something on the ground that wasn't straw. He held the lantern down and found a tin box, partially buried under the straw and the dirt, with a hasp block that hadn't been locked. Inside the box were 2 folded telegrams. The first telegram was addressed to Deke Calloway and was signed with initials only, VB. It read, Confirm schedule for water access. Mercer must be occupied elsewhere during transfer window. Advise when ready. The second telegram was addressed not to Calloway, but to Eleanor. It was a copy, or what appeared to be a copy, of the wire Arvid Crane had sent 9 days ago. And it was signed, at the bottom, in a different hand. She knows more than she says. Ask her about Springfield. Silas stood in the barn with the lantern and the 2 telegrams for a long time, long enough that the mare shifted and stamped and looked at him with the large, patient eyes of a horse waiting for someone to do something useful. He walked back to the main house. Eleanor was in the kitchen. This was, by now, so consistent that it had stopped being something he noticed and had become simply the state of the kitchen. Eleanor in it, working at something, lamp burning, the smell of coffee or food or both. He came in the back door and set the 2 telegrams on the table in front of her without preamble. She looked down at them. She went very still. Deke's been taking money from Blackthorne, Silas said. His voice was quiet. Not loud the way anger is loud. Quiet the way anger is quiet when it has had about 30 seconds to get itself under control. I found these buried in the barn. The box was his. He paused. The second one is yours. Eleanor sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the telegrams and the particular controlled stillness of a person who is deciding, right now, in this moment, how much truth to spend. She had prepared for this conversation in the abstract. She had told herself she would manage it carefully, introduce facts gradually, maintain the ground she'd established here before surrendering the complication of what she knew. She had been sensible about it, strategic. She had planned it the way she planned most things. But sitting across from a man who was looking at her with not anger exactly, with something more specific than anger, something that looked like disappointed, and knowing that he'd found it like this, in a barn, by accident, in the dark, all the preparation felt like a coat that didn't fit anymore. She picked up the first telegram and read it, then the second. "Deke's been feeding information to Blackthorn," she said, "about this ranch, about me." "So it appears." Silas pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. "Eleanor, who is Victor Blackthorn to you?" The question was direct and quiet and inevitable. She'd known it was coming since the day she arrived. Knowing something is coming doesn't make it feel less like impact. "He's my half-brother," she said. The silence in the kitchen was complete. Outside, the wind had stopped for once, and there was no fire sound because the coals had burned down, and the lamp was the only thing moving, the flame going slightly with the air from under the door. Silas looked at her. His expression was doing something she hadn't seen it do before. Cycling through several things in rapid succession, none of them clean. "Your half-brother," he said. "Yes, Victor Blackthorn, the man who's been stripping this ranch apart piece by piece for 2 years. Your half-brother." "Yes." He stood up. He didn't do it violently. He just stood up because sitting down with this information seemed wrong, seemed physically incompatible with what it was. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her. "How long have you known he was here?" "I've known where he was for 3 years," Eleanor said. "I came here because of it." She heard his breathing change. A slow, deliberate exhale. "You came here because of Blackthorn." "I came here because of Blackthorn and because your letter was the only one I answered. Those are both true at the same time." He turned around. "That's not the same as being honest." "No," she said. "It isn't. I know that." He was looking at her with an expression that was doing too many things at once, betrayal and anger and something that was asking a question underneath those, something trying to understand rather than just react. She held his gaze because looking away would be worse than whatever came next. "Tell me," he said. "All of it. Right now." She told him. She hadn't said it aloud to anyone since Arvid Crane 3 years ago in a law office in Springfield that smelled of cigarette smoke and old paper. Saying it now in this kitchen felt different, raw, less managed. She told it without pausing to shape it, which meant it came out in the order it had happened rather than the order that made the most sense. And she had to backtrack twice, and her voice did something once that she would have preferred it not to do. She and Victor Blackthorn shared a father, a prosperous Springfield merchant named Orlon Ashcroft, who had married twice and been, in Eleanor's assessment, a better businessman than he was a father to either family. Victor was the older child of the first marriage, Eleanor of the second. When Orlon died in 1878, he left a combined estate of considerable value, including a dry goods business, 2 properties, and a set of investment accounts that were supposed to be divided equally between his 2 surviving children. Victor contested the will. This was expected and manageable. What was not expected was what Victor did while the legal contest was being processed. He moved money. Systematically, across a period of 8 months, using his position as interim estate manager, a position granted during the legal proceedings, to shift funds through a series of business transactions that looked, on the surface, entirely legitimate. By the time Eleanor's lawyer understood what was happening, the majority of the liquid assets were gone, moved into accounts that existed in names that weren't Victor Blackthorn, in states that weren't Illinois. The dry goods business had been sold to a business partner of Victor's at a price 20% below market value. The properties were mortgaged, and then Victor had done the thing that Eleanor had never, not once in 4 years, stopped being furious about. He had filed a complaint with the county court claiming that Eleanor had been the one mismanaging the estate. He had produced documents, forged, every one of them, but produced, that suggested Eleanor had been embezzling from the accounts for the duration of the legal proceedings. The charge was dismissed eventually, but it took 18 months and cost Eleanor the last of what she had. And by the time it was over, Victor Blackthorne was in Montana territory with a new name on his operation and a great deal of money that didn't belong to him. And Eleanor Ashcroft was in Springfield with nothing except the truth. And the ledger. The ledger she had taken from Orlon Ashcroft's office the night before Victor had the locks changed. A thin, leather-bound accounting book in which Orlon had, with the meticulous habit of a careful businessman, recorded every transaction he'd overseen during his lifetime, including the transactions from the investment accounts, including amounts and dates and account names that, cross-referenced with the forged documents Victor had produced, proved not only that the forgeries were forgeries, but that Victor had known the true account numbers and amounts at the time he'd claimed not to know them. It was the kind of evidence that didn't shout. It whispered, precisely, into the ear of anyone who knew how to read it. She'd carried it for 3 years. She'd been waiting for a moment and a position that would make it count. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Silas had sat back down at some point during the telling. She wasn't sure when. He was sitting with his elbows on the table and his hands clasped, looking at the surface of the wood. He was not looking at her, and she let him not look for a moment. "The ledger," he said finally. "You have it here." "In my bag," she said. He looked up at that. "You've been carrying proof of his fraud in your canvas bag." "In my kitchen." "Yes." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh and almost something else entirely. "Eleanor, I know how it sounds. It sounds like you moved 3,000 miles to go after your half-brother using my ranch as a base of operations," he said. His voice was controlled, but the edges of it were frayed. "That's one way to put it. Is it wrong?" She looked at him squarely. "It's incomplete," she said. "I moved 3,000 miles because I had nothing left, and he was here, and the law in Springfield had finished being useful to me. I answered your letter because it was the right letter. I have tried, every single day since I got off that train, to be useful to this ranch, and fair to you. That's also true. All of it is true simultaneously." "You could have told me," he said. "And you would have believed me?" she said. "A woman off the train from Illinois, telling you your most dangerous rival is her half-brother, and she's got evidence against him in her luggage, the day I arrived?" He was quiet. "You would have put me back on the train," she said, not as an accusation, as a fact, calmly delivered. Another silence. Longer this time. She could hear him thinking. Not the surface of it, but the movement underneath, the way you can feel a river current without seeing the bottom. "The telegrams Deke's been sending," Silas said slowly. "If Blackthorne knows you're here—" "He may have recognized me when he came to the ranch," Eleanor said. "Or Deke described me. Either way, yes. He knows, or he suspects, and the telegram from my lawyer confirms he's looking." "Then we're out of time," Silas said. "We were always out of time," Eleanor said. "We were just pretending otherwise." He looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low, and the kitchen was full of shadows at the edges, and she was aware, more aware than was comfortable, of how much depended on what happened in the next few minutes. Not strategy, not plans, not clever moves, just whether this man across the table decided she was worth trusting, after everything she'd just handed him to distrust. "Show me the ledger," he said. She got it from the bag and set it on the table between them. He opened it without touching it first, just looked at the cover, then the first page. She watched his eyes move across the columns of figures, the dates, the account names. He was not a man who read accounting with any great speed, but he was a careful reader, the kind who makes sure of what he's reading before he moves on. He turned pages for a long time. Finally, he closed it. He left his hand on the cover, palm flat. "If this is what you say it is," he said, "this could end him. If we get it to the right person, a federal judge or the territorial banking authority. Not the local court. Blackthorne has connections there. It needs to go higher." She paused. "I've known that for 3 years. The problem was never the evidence. The problem was getting to a position where I could move it without being discredited first. And this ranch is that position," he said. "A married woman established in the territory with a legitimate stake in the valley." "Yes." She met his eyes. That's harder to dismiss than a single woman from out of state with a grudge. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the wind had started again, low and steady through the eaves. "You used me," he said. "Yes," she said, "and I've tried to earn it back every day since. I know that's not the same as not doing it." Another silence. This one was different from the others. It was less the silence of a man deciding, and more the silence of a man who has already decided but needs a moment to settle into the weight of it. "Deke," he said, "he needs to go, tonight, before he sends anything else." "I'll handle Deke." He stood up. "The ledger stays with you. Don't put it back in the bag, find somewhere better." He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. "And Eleanor." She looked up. "If there's anything else you haven't told me," he said, "now would be the time." She thought about Arvid Crane's telegram, burned behind Morrison's dry goods. She thought about the wire she'd sent back. Yes, and what it meant that Victor now knew she was here and knew that she knew. "Blackthorn won't wait," she said. "Whatever he's planning with the water access, the telegram to Deke mentioned a transfer window. I don't know what that means yet, but he's moving." Silas put his hat on. His face had settled into something she hadn't seen from him before. Not the controlled blankness he usually wore, but something below it. Something that was actually him rather than the version of him he showed the world. "Then we'd better move first," he said, and went out into the dark. Eleanor sat alone in the kitchen with the ledger in front of her and her hands in her lap, and the lamp burning its last good hour. She had been carrying the weight of this for 3 years. She had carried it across half a country and through 2 months of careful silence in this house, and through every early morning and late night and controlled, measured conversation. She had carried it the way you carry something you can't put down. Not because you're strong, but because putting it down means it falls, and you know what happens when it falls. She picked up the ledger and held it in both hands and thought about her father's careful handwriting on every page, the meticulous record of a man who had trusted the wrong son with the wrong things. She thought about Victor Blackthorn's face on the porch that morning, that practiced pleasantness, that controlled, calculating smile. She put the ledger inside her coat against her body. Then she got up, banked the fire, and listened to the house settle around her in the cold Montana night, waiting for the sound of Silas dealing with Deke Calloway in the bunkhouse. It came about 10 minutes later. Raised voices, brief and harsh, then the sounds of movement, then silence. Then boots on the porch steps, and the door opening, and Silas's face in the lamplight, set, tired, certain. "He's gone," Silas said. "Good," Eleanor said. They looked at each other across the kitchen. 2 people who had just stepped off a ledge they'd been standing on the edge of since October, falling into whatever came next, and both of them aware that the falling had only just begun. Deke Calloway was gone, but the damage he'd done wasn't. He hadn't already spent in private. Deke had been taking money from Blackthorn. Deke had been sending information. Deke was no longer on the ranch, and anyone who had a problem with that decision was welcome to follow him down the road. Nobody moved. Pete looked at the frozen ground for a moment and then looked up. "How long?" he asked. "Don't know exactly. Long enough." Carlos said something in Spanish under his breath that wasn't a prayer and wasn't quite a curse, but was somewhere in the territory between the two. Holt said nothing, which was normal, but the set of his jaw said enough. "What does Blackthorn know?" Pete asked. "More than we'd like," Silas said. "Less than he thinks he does." That last part was Eleanor's framing, and Silas had borrowed it because it was accurate and because the men needed something that wasn't pure bad news to hold on to. He'd talked with Eleanor until nearly 2 in the morning at the kitchen table, going through what Deke had likely seen and reported versus what he couldn't have known. The ledger, for one. Deke had never been in the main house, had never seen the canvas bag, had never seen Eleanor do anything more than cook and manage supplies and correct the payroll. What he would have told Blackthorn was the surface of things, that Eleanor was capable, that she was changing the ranch's operations, that she asked questions about Blackthorn by name. That last part was the problem. Because a woman who arrived from Illinois and asked about Victor Blackthorn by name within her first week was not a coincidence a man like Victor would let lie. The telegram language, transfer window, water access, had kept Silas up after Eleanor went to bed. He'd sat with it until he understood it, And when he understood it, he'd had to sit with the understanding for a while before he could be calm about it. The river that ran through the north edge of Red Ridge Ranch was the only reliable water source for 3 properties in the valley, including Silas's. The water rights were a matter of territorial record, properly filed, legally clear. But water rights in Montana Territory in 1884 were only as solid as the men willing to enforce them, and the nearest federal marshal's office was in Helena, a hard 2-day ride. If Blackthorn put armed men at the river crossing, which was what water access transfer window meant, Silas was certain of it. He could cut off the ranch's water supply and force a legal dispute that would take months to resolve, months during which Red Ridge's cattle would be in serious trouble. And while Silas was dealing with the river, Blackthorn's lawyers would be filing papers in town, and whatever timeline Eleanor needed to get the ledger to a federal judge would compress into something unworkable. It was a clean plan. Silas had to give Victor Blackthorn that much. The man thought in systems, not incidents. Every move connected to the next one. So they had to break the system, not just the move. He explained this to Eleanor the next morning, over coffee, before the hands were up. She listened without interrupting, which he'd learned was her way of paying the most serious attention. "He needs me occupied and you eliminated," she said when he finished. "That's how I read it." "When does he move?" "Deke left Sunday night. Blackthorn will know by now that something changed. Either Deke told him before he left, or his absence tells the story on its own." Silas turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I'd say we have 3 days. Maybe 4. "Then we have 2 days, Ake," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "You always assume you have less time than you think," she said. "That way you're never caught short." She already had something in her head. He could see it the way he'd learned to see it, in the particular quality of her stillness, the way her eyes were focused on something slightly past the visible. He waited. "I need to get to Helena," she said. "Helena's 2 days by horse." "By the main road?" "Yes." She looked at him directly. "Is there another way?" "There's a pass through the Bitterroot that cuts half a day off. It's hard riding, and it's November." "I'm aware it's November." He rubbed his jaw. "Eleanor, if Blackthorn's already moving, then you need to make sure he thinks he's moving against what he expects," she said. "He expects you to come at the river with guns. He's planned for that. He has more men than you." She paused. "He has not planned for me to ride to Helena and walk into a federal judge's office and a territorial bank with an accounting ledger that documents 6 years of his fraud." The kitchen was quiet. "If I hold the river," Silas said slowly, "and you move, then he's fighting in 2 directions at once, and he can only win one of them." She held his gaze. "He will choose the river, because the river is what he can see. Men like Victor always defend what they can see." Silas was quiet for a long moment. He was running it through his head, and she let him run it, because he needed to find the problems in it himself before he could commit to it. That was who he was. She'd learned that about him by now. "Carlos," he said finally, "Carlos rides like he was born on a horse." "I know," she said. "I'll send Carlos with you." "I'd rather go alone." "I'd rather you didn't." He said it with a firmness that was different from stubbornness. It wasn't "I'm in charge" firmness, it was something more specific and harder to argue with. 2 days through the Bitterroot Pass in November alone, with whatever Blackthorn may or may not have on the road. No. She considered this. "Carlos?" she agreed. He nodded. "You'll leave before light the day after tomorrow. That gives me today and tomorrow to get the men positioned at the canyon above the river crossing. If Blackthorn moves early, we hold him there." He paused. "And if he has more men than I think he does, then you hold him long enough," Eleanor said. "That's all I need. Long enough." He looked at her across the table, in the early morning dark of the kitchen, and there was something in his face that he didn't try to conceal the way he usually concealed things, which she noticed and didn't comment on. "How long do you need?" he asked. "If we ride hard, we reach Helena by late afternoon of the second day. Judge Harlan Foss handles federal property crimes for the territory. I wrote to him 6 weeks ago." She watched Silas's expression change at this. "I know. I should have told you. You wrote to a federal judge 6 weeks ago." "I wrote to establish contact. I told him I was a landowner in the valley with evidence of large-scale financial fraud, and that I would be presenting it formally when conditions permitted. She paused. He wrote back. He's interested. Silas let out a breath that was largely exhaustion and partially something that was almost a laugh. Is there anything else you arranged before talking to me? The Territorial Bank, she said. First Territorial of Helena. The fraud touched their accounts. They have standing to act, and the incentive. She looked at him steadily. I've been building toward this for 3 years, Silas. I didn't stop building when I got here. He was quiet. She watched him absorb the full shape of it. Not just what she'd told him last night, but the scope of the preparation. The fact that she had moved into his house and his life and his ranch already in motion, already mid-plan. She'd told him last night that she'd used him and tried to earn it back. Looking at his face now, she wasn't sure whether the earning had reached far enough. If this works, he said finally. When it works, she said. Because she needed to say it that way, not out of arrogance, but because she couldn't afford the other framing. Not now. Something shifted in his face, a kind of recognition, the way you recognize something you didn't know you were looking for. When it works, he repeated. Blackthorn goes to prison, and his operation gets seized. Everything he built with stolen money, yes. That's most of the east side of the valley. Yes, she said. He was quiet again, and she understood why. Because the east side of the valley meant land, meant water rights, meant an opportunity that sat in complicated proximity to justice. She didn't say anything about it because she didn't need to. He was an honest man. She'd known that since the first night with the ledger. I'm not interested in what he built, Silas said. I'm interested in what he took. So am I, she said. They sat with that for a moment, and it was the most honest thing they'd said to each other since the night she'd told him everything. The next day and a half were the longest Silas could remember in recent years, and his recent years had contained some long stretches. He moved Pete and Holt and 3 of the remaining hands up to the canyon above the river crossing, positioning them along the ridge where the terrain narrowed and the high ground belonged to whoever arrived first. They brought enough ammunition and enough food for 3 days, which Silas hoped was more than they'd need and feared was exactly right. He left one hand at the ranch, a young, steady man named Thomas, who was 17 and serious about it, with instructions to watch the road and not do anything heroic. He rode back to the main house the evening before Eleanor and Carlos were set to leave and found Eleanor at the kitchen table with the ledger open, going through it one last time. She'd wrapped it in oilcloth and then in a second layer of heavy canvas tied with leather cord. It sat on the table between them like something that had been waiting a long time for this moment. You know the judge's office, the bank. You have everything you need? Silas asked. Yes. She closed the ledger. I've also written out a sworn statement documenting the supply invoice fraud and the pattern of employee poaching. It's circumstantial compared to the ledger, but it establishes a local pattern that supports the larger charges. She looked up. It has your name on it as a corroborating witness. I should have asked you first. That's fine, he said. I'll swear to it. I know. That's why I wrote it. She tied the oilcloth package shut and set it in the canvas bag next to a change of clothes and a box of ammunition for the rifle she planned to carry. Are the men positioned? Pete's at the north ridge. Holt's below the crossing. We hold the high ground as long as we hold it. He paused. If Blackthorn moves before you reach Helena. I know, she said. She didn't finish the sentence because finishing it would mean saying out loud what happened to men on ridges when the other side has more guns and more time. She had thought about it all night and had no solution for it except speed, which was all she'd ever had. Silas, she said, and the way she said it made him look at her. She so rarely put emphasis on his name that when she did it registered completely. Don't let him draw you into the open. The canyon is your position. You hold it and you don't move off it, whatever he tells you. What does that mean, whatever he tells me? She was quiet for a beat. Victor is good at bait, she said. He's been good at it since we were children. He finds the thing you care about, and he puts it in the open, and while you're moving toward it, he gets behind you. She met his eyes. What he'll use is the ranch. He'll make a move against the buildings, or the cattle, or Thomas, something that pulls you off the ridge. Don't move. Silas looked at her steadily. And if he goes after Thomas? I told Thomas to ride for Pete the second he sees anyone on the road he doesn't know, Eleanor said. He's 17 and he's not stupid. Silas worked his jaw. She could see him fighting with it. The instinct of a man who protects his own running directly into the strategic truth of what she was saying. She understood both things and didn't try to make either one smaller. "Hold the canyon," she said again quietly. "I'll hold the canyon," he said. They left it there, which was the only place they could leave it. Carlos Reyes appeared at the back door at 4 in the morning with 2 horses saddled and his rifle across his saddle, and the calm, ready expression of a man who had done hard things before and was not frightened by the prospect of doing them again. Eleanor came out with the canvas bag across her body, her heaviest coat, and her own rifle. She'd braided her hair tight against her head for the ride. Silas was standing on the porch. He handed her a rolled paper as she came down the steps. "Letter of introduction," he said, "to Judge Foss. From me. It says I know the contents of the ledger and will testify to the local pattern of fraud and that Eleanor Ashcroft Mercer is acting with my full authority." She took the letter and looked at him. "You didn't have to—" "I know." He held her gaze. "Ride hard." "I intend to." She put the letter inside her coat against the ledger. "Silas?" She paused, and he waited, and she said the only thing there was to say that was both true and small enough to fit into a 4 in the morning moment before a hard ride. "Don't get shot." "I'll do my best," he said, which was not a promise but was the closest he could honestly get to one. She put her boot in the stirrup and mounted, and she and Carlos rode out of the yard at a walk that became a trot at the end of the lane and then opened up on the road north, and Silas stood on the porch in the dark and watched the sound of hoofbeats get smaller until it was gone. Then he put his hat on and rode for the canyon. Victor Blackthorne moved on the second morning. He came with 9 men, which was 3 more than Silas had anticipated, and 2 more than Silas's entire force at the canyon. They came up the valley road before sunrise, well armed and organized in the way that hired guns are organized when they've been well paid and clearly directed, and they stopped at the river crossing and found it blocked. Not by Silas's men, not yet. By a simple, heavy chain strung between 2 posts, with a padlocked gate and a sign that said in Eleanor's clear handwriting, "Red Ridge Ranch, Private Water Rights, Territorial Deed, 1881-44. Trespass is a federal offense." It wasn't the chain that slowed them. It was the sign. Specifically the word federal, which did something to hired men that the word private never does. It reminded them that the man paying them today might not be able to reach them where federal charges put them. The hesitation lasted about 4 minutes. Then the man leading Blackthorne's crew, a thick-necked individual named Garrett, who had done this kind of work in 3 territories and had the face to prove it, cut the chain with bolt cutters and led the group across the river crossing and into the canyon approach. Where Pete Dunlap was waiting on the north ridge with a Winchester and an excellent angle. The first shot hit the dirt 6 feet in front of Garrett's horse. The horse decided it was done and expressed this opinion at some volume. The other horses agreed, and for 30 seconds the canyon approach was a democratic chaos of rearing animals and cursing men, during which Pete put 2 more shots into the ground. Not at anyone. Into the ground, because Pete was a good shot and a careful man, and had very specific instructions about the order in which things were to escalate. "That's far enough," Pete called down from the ridge. His voice carried clean and flat in the cold morning air. "You're trespassing on private water rights under territorial deed. Turn around." Garrett got his horse settled and looked up at the ridge with the expression of a professional assessing a professional. "We got authorization from Victor Blackthorne," he called back. "He's filed a water use dispute with the county." "File it with the territory," Pete said. "Today you're trespassing. Take your men and go." There was a pause. Garrett turned his horse and rode back to confer with 2 other men, and this conference lasted several minutes, during which Holt materialized on the south side of the canyon with his own rifle and the particular stillness of a large man who is not nervous, which is its own kind of authority. The arithmetic had shifted. 9 men against high ground and crossfire was a different calculation from 9 men against a chain and a sign. Garrett came back. "We're not leaving," he said. "That's your right," Pete said, "but nobody's crossing this canyon today." They settled into it. The grinding, ugly, exhausting work of a standoff. No grand confrontation, no dramatic charge, just men on opposite sides of a position, each waiting for the other to make an error. The cold got into everything by mid-morning, the kind of Montana November cold that doesn't get dramatic about it, just gets steadily into your bones until thinking clearly becomes an act of will. Silas moved between positions, checking on his men, watching Blackthorn's crew for any movement that suggested a flanking attempt on the ridge. At noon, Victor Blackthorn himself arrived. He came in a different rig from the hired one, his own, a good black coach with his brand on the door, which struck Silas as a particular kind of arrogance, or maybe just confidence. He climbed down and stood at the edge of the standoff and looked up at the canyon ridge, and then he turned and found Silas sitting on his horse about 30 yards behind the chain position. They looked at each other across the distance. Victor walked toward him. Silas held his position. He didn't ride forward, didn't give ground, made Blackthorn walk the whole 30 yards. When Victor reached him, he stopped and looked up with that practiced pleasantness on his face, wearing it over something much colder underneath. "Silas," he said, pleasant as a spring morning, "this is unnecessary." "The chain or the rifles?" "All of it. I filed a legitimate water use dispute with the county court. My legal right to access this waterway is—" "Your legal dispute will be heard by the county court," Silas said, "when they schedule it. Until then, this is my water, my deed, and those are my men on that ridge." He held Victor's gaze. "And if any of your people try to go around through the east draw, Holt will have a word with them from about 100 yards, which is close enough to be accurate and far enough to be legal." Something moved behind Victor Blackthorn's pleasantness. Not quite through it, but under it. Something that pulled tighter, the way a mask tightens when the face beneath it is doing something the mask isn't designed for. "Where's your wife?" Victor said. Silas kept his expression exactly where it was. "Home." "Is she?" It wasn't a question. "Funny. I had a man watching the ranch road last night, and he said he saw 2 riders leave before dawn." "My wife doesn't need your permission to ride on territorial roads," Silas said. Victor looked at him for a long moment. And then, with the smooth, terrible calm of a man who has just made a decision and closed a door behind it, he said, "Silas, I'm going to give you one opportunity to end this quietly. You're a practical man. I've always respected that about you. Whatever Eleanor has told you, whatever she's convinced you to believe about her, she has a history of making accusations that don't survive legal scrutiny. The county court in Springfield dismissed every claim she made against my family's estate. She was found to have mismanaged funds herself." "I know what the Springfield court found," Silas said. Victor paused. "Then you know she's not a reliable—" "I know what the Springfield court found," Silas said again, very quietly, "and I know why they found it. And I know what's in the ledger she's carrying right now." He watched Victor's face. The pleasantness didn't disappear. It was too practiced for that. But it changed. It went from a working expression to something that was being held in place by effort rather than habit. "You're going to want to get a lawyer," Silas said. "A good one. A federal one." Victor Blackthorn stood very still for 3 full seconds, which was 3 seconds longer than a confident man needed to formulate a response. Then he turned and walked back toward his men. Silas watched him go and kept his hand loose on his reins, and his face showing nothing at all, because showing nothing was the only move he had left, and he knew it. Blackthorn was going to regroup. He might push the canyon harder, or he might pull back and move through legal channels at speed, trying to get ahead of the ledger before it reached Helena. What he couldn't do was both things at once, and the fact that he had to choose was Eleanor's doing, not Silas's. Silas's job was to make sure Victor kept having to look at the canyon instead of at the road to Helena for as long as possible. He rode back up to Pete's position and told him to hold. Eleanor and Carlos reached the outskirts of Helena in the middle of the second afternoon, later than Eleanor had hoped, because the Bitterroot Pass had been worse than either of them expected. Ice on the trail from 3 days before. The horses picking their footing slow and careful through a section that cost them 2 hours they didn't have. Eleanor's hands were numb, and her left knee had seized up sometime in the first afternoon and hadn't fully loosened since, and she'd been riding through it because the alternative was not riding. Carlos had not complained once. She had not expected him to, but she was grateful anyway. in the specific way you're grateful to a person who shows up in full when the situation demands it. Helena was a town that had been growing faster than its infrastructure for a decade and looked it. Buildings in various states of completion, streets that were half paved and half mud, an optimistic energy that sat slightly at odds with the permanent smell of mining operations in the surrounding hills. Eleanor had never been here before, but she'd studied the map enough that she moved through it with reasonable confidence, which was most of what confidence was in her experience. Judge Harlan Foss's federal office was in a solid brick building on the main street. Eleanor dismounted, tied her horse, handed Carlos her rifle to hold, and went inside with the canvas bag over her shoulder and Silas's letter in her coat. The clerk inside was young and protective of his position in the way that young clerks are. "Judge Foss doesn't see people without an appointment," he said. "He corresponded with me 6 weeks ago about a matter of territorial fraud," Eleanor said. "My name is Eleanor Mercer. I have the evidence I referenced in that correspondence, and I have reason to believe the subject of that evidence is currently attempting to suppress it by force." She held the clerk's gaze. "I would appreciate a moment of the judge's time." The clerk looked at her for a moment, then went through the inner door. He came back in 4 minutes. "Judge Foss will see you now." Harlan Foss was a compact, gray-haired man in his 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the eyes of someone who had been lied to professionally for 40 years and had developed an extremely fine sensitivity to the specific quality of truth. He looked at Eleanor when she came in, and then he looked at the package she set on his desk, and then he looked at her again. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "sit down." She sat. She unwrapped the oilcloth. She placed the ledger on his desk, and then Silas's letter, and then her own sworn statement. She folded her hands in her lap. 6 years of documented fraud, she said. Victor Blackthorne, operating under his own name in Montana Territory, using funds fraudulently obtained from the estate of Orlon Ashcroft of Springfield, Illinois. The ledger is the primary record in my father's handwriting, which can be verified against known samples in the county records in Springfield. The letter is from my husband, Silas Mercer, corroborating the local pattern. She paused. And if you need a second opinion on the accounting, the First Territorial Bank of Helena has standing in this matter, and their records should confirm the account numbers on pages 9 through 14. Judge Foss picked up the ledger. He turned to page 9. He spent 3 minutes reading without looking up, and Eleanor sat in the chair and kept her hands folded and didn't move. Finally, the judge set the ledger down and looked at her over his glasses. "This is," he said carefully, "a considerable document." "Yes," she said. "You've had it for 3 years." "Yes." "Why now?" "Because I'm no longer alone," she said. The judge looked at her for another moment. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a pad of paper and a pen. "I'm going to need you to walk me through each entry you believe is directly evidential," he said. "This may take some time." "I have time," Eleanor said. Outside, Carlos Reyes sat on the hitching post in the late afternoon cold, with both rifles across his knees, watching the street in both directions. The steady and unhurried watchfulness of a man who is committed to a thing and intends to see it through to its end, however long that took. Back in the valley, as the afternoon light went gray and thin over the canyon, Pete Dunlap heard the sound of riders approaching from the south road and turned to find not Blackthorne's men, but 4 federal marshals in their distinctive coats, riding in a column of 2. They had come from the Dillon Telegraph Office, which had received a wire from Helena 40 minutes earlier, and they were carrying warrants in their saddlebags, and the lead marshal was a tall, deliberate man named Cutter, who had the expression of someone who had done this enough times to have stopped finding it dramatic. Marshal Cutter looked up at the canyon positions and then down at Blackthorne's crew below and said to Silas, very simply, "Which one is Garrett?" Silas pointed. Cutter nodded and rode down. The warrants were served in the diminishing afternoon light, methodically and without theater, and Blackthorne's hired men stood down because hired men, when the federal government arrives with paper, tend to recalculate quickly where their loyalties genuinely lie. Garrett protested loudly for about 90 seconds and then stopped, which was about the normal duration of that particular calculation. Victor Blackthorne was not at the canyon. Victor Blackthorne had left, Silas was told later, within 20 minutes of their conversation at the chain, had turned his coach around and ridden hard for his own ranch, which suggested that he'd read the situation faster than Silas had expected him to, or that he'd had a warning from somewhere. It didn't matter. The second set of warrants was waiting at the Anvil Creek Ranch when he arrived. He was arrested in his own entrance hall, in his good coat, with the practiced pleasantness still arranged on his face like something he'd forgotten to take off. Pete Dunlap, standing on the north ridge as the cold closed in and the last of the light left the canyon, heard the news from one of the marshals coming back through, and he sat down on a rock and put his head in his hands for a moment. Not crying, not dramatic, just a man who'd been running on tension for 2 days and needed 30 seconds to let his body know it was over. Then he stood up, put his hat on, and started the ride back to Red Ridge Ranch. Eleanor and Carlos rode back into Red Ridge Ranch on the evening of the third day. Not the second day as planned. The return through the Bitterroot Pass had cost them an extra half day when Carlos's horse threw a shoe on the ice-covered descent, and they'd had to lead both animals down the worst stretch on foot, in the dark, with a lantern that kept threatening to go out in the wind. Eleanor's left knee had stopped being merely painful somewhere around the second hour of that descent, and had moved into the category of things she was simply not thinking about until she had the luxury of stopping. She did not mention this to Carlos. He did not mention the cut on his hand from where he'd caught himself on the rocks when his horse had lurched. They were two people doing a hard thing, and neither of them needed the other to acknowledge how hard it was. They came down the ranch lane in the cold twilight, the horses tired and slow, and the first person Eleanor saw was Thomas. 17-year-old Thomas, standing on the porch of the main house with a lantern, scanning the road with the alert, strained expression of someone who had been watching for a long time and had started to worry that watching wasn't going to be enough. When he saw them, he let out a breath so audible she could hear it from 40 yards. "Mrs. Mercer," he called. "Mr. Silas has been back since yesterday. He's inside." She unsaddled her own horse. Her hands were clumsy with cold, but she did it anyway, because the horse had earned that much, and handed the animal to Thomas, and then she walked up the porch steps and through the front door and into the main house. Silas was at the kitchen table. He looked up when she came in, and the expression on his face moved through several things very quickly before it settled into something that was mostly relief, which on Silas Mercer's face was not a dramatic thing. Just a slight release around the eyes, a loosening of the jaw, the physical evidence of tension that had been held for 3 days finally finding somewhere to go. He stood up. He didn't say anything immediately, which was not unusual, but the quality of the silence was different this time. "Sit down," he said. "You look like the mountain one." "The mountain made its case," she said. "We made ours louder." She sat. Her knee was genuinely bad now. She could feel it swelling against the inside of her trousers. And she sat with the specific, deliberate care of someone managing damage they intend to deal with later. Silas noticed. He noticed everything. She'd learned that about him, even the things he didn't comment on. He poured coffee and set it in front of her and sat back down across the table. "Tell me," he said. She told him about Judge Foss, the 3 hours in the federal office going through the ledger page by page, the judge's careful, precise questions, the moment when Foss had set down his pen and looked at her and said quietly, "This is sufficient." She told him about the First Territorial Bank, whose senior officer had turned a particular shade of gray when she'd shown him the account numbers on pages 9 through 14, because those account numbers matched accounts that his institution had been told were legitimate business holdings of a Montana ranching operation. And the discrepancy between what he'd been told and what the ledger showed was the kind of discrepancy that kept bank officers awake at night. She told him about the warrants being drafted, the marshal's office being contacted, the deputy who had ridden out that same evening. Silas listened to all of it in the attentive, still way he listened to things that mattered. "Victor's in federal custody in Helena," she said. "The Anvil Creek assets are frozen pending the fraud investigation. It'll take months to fully adjudicate. These things always do. But the outcome isn't in question." She paused. "Arvid Crane, my lawyer in Springfield, is filing parallel charges with the Illinois court to recover the estate assets that can still be recovered." She looked at her coffee. "Most of the liquid funds are probably gone. Victor moved them too well over too many years. But the properties in Springfield may be recoverable, and whatever the territorial court seizes from Anvil Creek goes back to whoever he stole it from," Silas said. "In theory. In legal practice, it's more complicated. But yes, in theory." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Pete told me about the canyon," Eleanor said. "He came to find me this morning before you were up. He wanted me to know." She looked at Silas. "You held it." "We held it," he said. "Pete and Holt held it. I mostly rode back and forth looking determined. That's not what Pete said. Pete's loyal. He flatters upward." But something in Silas's face shifted. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. The marshals arrived before it came to anything serious. Victor pulled out the moment he saw which way it was going. He paused. He knew, didn't he? When I told him about the ledger, he knew it was already moving. "He's always known when to run," Eleanor said. "That's how he survived this long." Silas nodded slowly. "And now?" She looked at him across the table. The kitchen was warm. Someone had kept the fire going, Thomas probably, and the lamp was burning at the corner of the table, and outside the window the Montana dark had settled in full, the way it settled in November, heavy and complete. She was exhausted in a way that went past the physical into something structural, the exhaustion of a person who has been holding an enormous thing for a very long time and has just set it down. "Now it's over," she said. "Or it's beginning to be over, which is as close as these things get." Silas looked at her for a long moment. There was something he was working toward. She could see the approach of it, the way you can see weather coming across an open valley. "What do you want to do?" he asked. It was a simple question, and also not a simple question at all. She understood both layers of it. The surface layer was practical. What were her plans now? What happened to the arrangement they'd made? Where did things stand? The layer underneath it was the one they hadn't addressed directly, the one that had been accumulating since the first night at this table, since the ledger and the coffee, and the conversations that started as strategy and ended as something harder to categorize. "I want to sleep for approximately 2 days," she said. He almost smiled. "After that." She looked at him steadily. "I want to stay," she said. If that's still a question. I'm aware that a good portion of what I told you 3 days ago gave you legitimate reasons to want me gone. I'm aware that what I did, the way I came here, was not entirely fair to you." She didn't look away. "But I've been here 2 months, and I've worked every day for this ranch as though it were my own, because somewhere in the middle of it, it started to feel like it was. And I don't know what to do with that except be honest about it." Silas was quiet. The fire shifted in the stove, a log settling. "The night you told me about Blackthorn," he said, "I sat up for a long time after you went to bed, trying to decide if I was angry." He paused. "I was, some, but mostly what I was, was tired of pretending I hadn't noticed you." He looked at the table, then back at her. "Not as a partner or a useful person or whatever I told myself when I wrote that letter. Just you." A beat. "I'm not a man who says things like that easily." "I know," she said. "That's how I know you mean it." They sat with that for a moment. Two people who were not romantic in the conventional sense, and were not going to pretend to be, but who had arrived at something that was more solid than romance and less fragile. Something built from the specific materials of who they actually were. "Your knee," he said, "needs ice and rest." "I'll get the ice." He stood up. "You'll stay off it tomorrow." "I'll stay off it for the morning," she said. "Eleanor." "I'll stay off it for most of the morning," she said. And this time what crossed her face was unambiguously a smile, not a performance of one, and Silas looked at it for a second longer than he needed to before he went to get the ice. The news of Victor Blackthorn's arrest reached Dillon within 2 days, which in a small Montana town meant that within 3 days every person in the valley had heard 3 versions of it, each more elaborate than the last. The version that spread fastest was largely accurate, which was unusual, but the facts were dramatic enough on their own that they didn't require embellishment. A federal fraud case spanning 2 states, a ledger hidden for years, a woman who had ridden through the Bitterroot Pass in November to deliver it personally to a federal judge. Ed Grady, who had laughed on the platform at Dillon Station in October, heard the full account from Gerald Morrison at the dry goods in Fenton, and he went quiet in a way that was not his natural state. "She did all that," he said. "Rode 2 days through the pass in November with the evidence," Morrison said. She'd been building toward it for 3 years, came here specifically to finish it. He paused. She also switched her supply account from Harlan's to me back in October when she found the invoice fraud. Sharp eye on a ledger. Ed Grady drove home from Fenton without saying much to anyone. At Red Ridge Ranch, the changes happened slowly and then all at once, the way real changes usually do. The most immediate and practical change was the water. With Blackthorn's operation frozen and his hired men dispersed, the river crossing was uncontested, the chain and the sign came down. And the North Pasture cattle had access to the water they'd been restricted from for 2 solid years. Silas hadn't realized how much of his operational stress had come from managing that water constraint until it was simply gone. And the relief of it was not dramatic, but was constant. Like a stone removed from a boot you'd been wearing so long you'd stopped remembering the stone was there. The supply chain stabilized further through the winter. Eleanor negotiated a long-term account with Morrison's that included volume pricing, which required several conversations and one fairly sharp disagreement about terms that she won by being more prepared than Morrison expected, after which he gave her the pricing without further resistance and seemed to respect her more for the argument. She renegotiated the hay contract with a grower 2 valleys over. She found a replacement for the windbreak lumber that had been ordered through a Blackthorn-affiliated supplier and was consequently both overpriced and underdelivered. She did all of this without making it a performance. It was simply what needed doing, and she did it. Angus Price lasted through the winter sober, which surprised several people. He was not a changed man. Eleanor had not promised him he would become one, which she thought was the only reason he'd stayed. But he was a functioning man, which was what the ranch needed. On the days he struggled, which he did, he struggled quietly and came to work anyway, and Eleanor worked alongside him without comment, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Carlos Reyes got a raise in January, negotiated by Eleanor on his behalf without telling him she was doing it, so that when Silas told him about it, Carlos assumed Silas had initiated it, which Eleanor intended. She told Silas why she'd done it that way. He thought about it for a moment and said, "That's more complicated than just telling him." She said, "He's 23 and proud, and it's his first real position. He needs to know his boss values him, not that his boss's wife intervened." Silas looked at her for a moment and then said, Yeah, okay." Pete Dunlap, who had been at Red Ridge Ranch for 7 years and had watched it go from flourishing to struggling to the edge of breaking, began to say things like, "This time last year," in a tone that made the comparison without stating it. The comparison was always favorable to now. The legal proceedings around the Blackthorn estate moved at the pace of legal proceedings everywhere, which is to say, slowly, with regular letters from Arvid Crane in Springfield that Eleanor read at the kitchen table and then summarized for Silas, because the legal language was dense and Arvid had never learned to write plainly. The fraud charges were solid. Judge Foss had said so, and the First Territorial Bank's cooperation had added financial weight that the case would have lacked otherwise. The Illinois charges were proceeding in parallel. Victor Blackthorn had retained good lawyers, which was expected, and the good lawyers were making the expected arguments, which would delay things by months, but would not ultimately change them. The evidence was what it was. Eleanor received a formal letter in February from the Springfield County Probate Court, informing her that a partial recovery of estate assets was now underway, and that she was named as primary claimant. The numbers in the letter were not what they would have been if the fraud had never happened. They never would be, because money moved the way Victor had moved, it didn't come back whole. But they were not nothing. They were, in fact, enough to matter, which was more than Eleanor had let herself expect. She showed the letter to Silas without preamble, setting it on the table beside his coffee. He read it. He set it down. "That's yours," he said. "I know. What do you want to do with it?" She had thought about this. She'd thought about it since she'd first calculated what a partial recovery might look like, in the early sleepless weeks after arriving in Montana. She had prepared several reasonable answers: a reserve fund, investment in the herd, infrastructure for the ranch. "I want to put it into the ranch," she said, "as my share, as an owner." Silas looked at her. "You're already as a named partner," she said, "formally, in the deed." A pause. not a long one. That's what you want. That's what makes sense, she said. And yes, it's what I want. He nodded slowly, and she could see him working through the implications. Not reluctantly, but carefully, the way he worked through everything that mattered. I'll have it drawn up, he said, when the funds transfer. Thank you, she said. You don't have to thank me. You earned it. I know I earned it, she said. I'm thanking you anyway. Something in his face did the thing it did sometimes now, and that small, real shift that she'd learned to read as the closest Silas Mercer got to showing what he actually felt without narrating it. She had come to value that shift more than she would have valued a man who talked about his feelings constantly, because when Silas showed something, it was because it was real, not because it was expected. Spring came to the valley in the incremental, muddy, unheroic way that spring always comes to Montana. Not all at once, but in grudging concessions, the snow retreating uphill, the ground softening, the creek running high and loud with snowmelt. The cattle came through the winter better than they had the previous year, which Pete attributed to the hay supply and the better water access, and Silas attributed to Pete's management, and Eleanor attributed to all of those things at once, and didn't see the point in ranking them. The Anvil Creek property, seized by the territorial court pending the fraud adjudication, sat empty through the winter. In March, the territorial administrator made an inquiry to Silas about whether Red Ridge Ranch had interest in leasing the East pasture lands during the proceedings, at a rate well below market value given the circumstances. Silas discussed it with Eleanor for an evening and then wrote back that yes, they were interested, and that Mrs. Eleanor Mercer would be handling the negotiation on behalf of Red Ridge Ranch. The administrator, who had not dealt with Eleanor before, responded promptly and professionally, and did not make the mistake of underestimating her that most people made the first time. He did not make it the second time either. By April, Red Ridge Ranch was running cattle on grazing land that extended twice as far as it had the previous October. Silas hired 3 additional hands, good ones, people Pete vouched for, and the bunkhouse had the particular sound of a place that has found its level again. The ordinary noise of men working and eating and arguing about small things because there are no large things to argue about right now. It was in April that Pete Dunlap, sitting in the cookhouse after supper with Carlos and Holt and the 3 new men, said without particular announcement, "You know what we ought to call her?" Carlos looked up. "Call who?" "Mrs. Mercer." Pete poured himself more coffee. "The Iron Queen of Red Ridge." He said it simply, as though he'd been thinking about it for a while and had decided it fit. She held this place together when it was coming apart. She took down Blackthorn from inside his own territory, and she did it without anybody handing her anything. He looked around the table. Iron Queen. Holt nodded. This was a significant endorsement from Holt. Carlos said, "She'd hate that title." "Probably," Pete agreed. "That's how you know it's right." Eleanor found out about it from Thomas, who was 17 and had not yet learned that some things should travel slower than they do. He mentioned it in passing one morning while she was inventorying the supply shed, said it the way young people say things, assuming she already knew, or not considering that she might not. She went very still for a moment. Then she went back to the inventory. She didn't say anything about it to Silas until that evening when they were sitting on the porch after supper in the cool April dark. A new habit, neither of them had announced it. It had just started happening in March and continued. She told him what Thomas had said. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. "No," she said. "It would have 6 months ago. When I arrived and they laughed on the platform, being noticed for how I looked, what I was, what I wasn't, that bothered me. Not because I was ashamed, because it was loud and I couldn't do anything about it yet." She paused. "Now they've seen what I actually am. That's different." "What are you?" he asked. Not rhetorically, genuinely. She considered. "Someone who finishes what she starts," she said, "and doesn't need applause for it, but doesn't mind when it's accurate." He looked out at the dark valley, the mountains black against the sky. "Iron Queen," he said quietly, with something in his voice that was not irony. "Don't," she said. "I like it." "Silas, I'm just saying it fits." She looked at him, and he was looking at her. And what passed between them in that moment was not the kind of thing that translated cleanly into words. It was the look of two people who have been through something hard together and have found, on the other side of it, that they prefer being on the same side to being on any other. Not a fairy story, not a romance in the way the word gets used for soft, convenient things. Something more functional and more honest than that, something that had been tested by the specific conditions of their lives and had not broken. She looked away first, back at the dark valley. "The south fence line needs work," she said. "I know," he said. "Pete said 3 of the posts are rotting through. I'll send Carlos tomorrow. Send Thomas with him. He needs the experience and Carlos is patient." "Good idea," he said. They sat in the ordinary quiet of two people who have more work tomorrow than they have hours for it, and who know this, and who are nevertheless sitting on a porch in the dark, taking 20 minutes because 20 minutes is what they have, and that is enough. This is the thing that the story of Eleanor Ashcroft and Red Ridge Ranch finally comes to, in the end, underneath all the ledgers and warrants and canyon standoffs and long, cold rides. It comes to a porch in April, and two people who chose each other not in a moment of feeling, but in a series of ordinary, difficult, deliberate mornings. Not because the world gave them an easy road, because they built one out of what was available, which was hard land and hard truth and the specific quality of each other. The ranch that had been failing slowly, invisibly, was now running solid. Not spectacular, not without problems, but solid in the way that things are solid when they're built correctly. The men who worked it knew what they were part of. The woman who ran its operations had her name on the deed and her hands in the work every day and asked for no recognition beyond the accurate kind. The man who had built it from the ground up 20 years ago understood. Now that the best decision he'd ever made was not a business decision at all. It was the decision, on a cold November night in a kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and honesty, to trust someone who had given him reasons not to, because the reasons too were more fundamental. Victor Blackthorne was convicted in federal court the following autumn on 11 counts of financial fraud, embezzlement, and criminal misrepresentation. He received a sentence of 12 years. He served 9. Eleanor read the news of his conviction in a letter from Arvid Crane, sitting at the kitchen table at Red Ridge Ranch with her second cup of coffee. She read it through to the end, and then she set it down, and she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap in the quiet kitchen. Then she got up, washed her cup, and went out to help Carlos with the south pasture rotation, because it was a Thursday in October and there was work to do, and the work was what kept things alive, which she had always known but understood now differently, not as a burden or a discipline, but as the ongoing, imperfect, honest act of staying. The sign above the ranch gate had been repainted in March. The letters were clear now. Red Ridge Ranch. Below it, Silas had added a line in smaller letters that Eleanor had seen and not commented on. It read, "Mercer and Mercer, established 1884. She'd never told him to add it. He'd never told her he was going to. That was in the end what trust looked like between two people who had earned it the hard way. Not announced, not performed, just quietly present, the way the best things in a life usually are.